It's Halloween once again. This is the spookiest time of year. Now, a lot of people will be celebrating with parties or watching Spooky Buddies on repeat, but on my channel I like to do things a little differently. Some of you might remember last year I did a countdown of the 5 most terrifying transgender activists out there. And this year, I have compiled a whole new list of horrors just for you. So let's get down to it. Let's get So the rules are simple. These are 5 activists who have been notable in 2019, not so much for their cringiness, but more for the damage which they are doing to the trans movement as a whole. Whether it is dangerous actions or anything which is particularly deranged, these are the people who are the true terrors of the trans world. So why am I compiling this list on Halloween of all days? Why am I not waiting until the end of the year?
Billy, it's Halloween! All the scariest monsters return this time of year.
Pretty much that. So let's begin the countdown. Now, a lot of people who use social media or are generally involved in politics in current year know how toxic online discussion can be. And it's a good job that most people know to just walk away from the screen when someone says something that you don't like, and not to just run off to the police or get the lawyers involved. But if you are a lawyer, a real lady lawyer, you can take all this action into your own hands. So I've not talked about Stephanie Hayden for quite a while on this channel. To refresh people's memories, she first became prominent last year as she sued the creator of Father Ted and also Dankula's arch nemesis Graham Linehan. The case was eventually dropped, leaving Linehan with quite a hefty legal bill to pay. However, Hayden saw this as a victory and in 2019 went on a rampage of issuing various lawsuits and reporting her enemies to the police. Notably, she got Kate Scottow into trouble. She is well known for being arrested in front of her children and thrown into a jail cell for 7 hours, reportedly having misgendered Hayden online. The story got so much traction that even Donald Trump Jr. tweeted about it. So Hayden is getting recognition in quite high places. But naturally, Hayden being Hayden simply wasn't happy with this, and following a report by the Daily Mail on her antics, she decided to sue the Daily Mail as well, for gross inaccuracies, including the fact that Hayden was born male. Kinda defeats the purpose of being a trans woman, don't you think? But naturally, Hayden's rampage didn't stop there. Along with other various lawsuits that Hayden has filed, another person who has become a victim is Caroline Farrow. She is a Catholic journalist who ran afoul of Hayden on Twitter, starting a bit of a slanging match between the pair. Hayden eventually got an injunction against Farrow for speaking about her online, but surprisingly, when the case was first issued, Hayden herself appeared in person to deliver the papers to Farrow, which is something that isn't really recommended that you do by the legal system in this country. You would think if someone was harassing you so much online, it was causing you genuine distress, you wouldn't be meeting this person face to face. However, Hayden being Hayden, just turns up looking a little bit like Tommy Robinson, I've got to say. Other cases Hayden has been involved in included getting Mumsnet to release information on one of the users who was bad-mouthing her, because that is a real crime right there. Just as a disclaimer, because Hayden is very trigger happy when it comes to flexing her real lady lawyer muscles, Some of the cases that Hayden is filing might well have merit. There hasn't really been much of a ruling in anyone's favour yet on anything which has been going on. There could indeed be more than meets the eye, as Hayden has recently said that these cases are more than just misgendering, but releasing private information, some of which seems to involve a particular situation from Hayden's pre-trans days which involved a golf club and a car, although strangely Hayden has alluded to this in some of her tweets. So my big concern with Hayden, and why I'm including her on this list, is someone who is really throwing their weight around with the law, and it appears to be a way of intimidating people not to speak ill of her. I think that regardless of whether people have been saying really, really mean things online or not, this is a way of shutting down people's freedom of speech and the freedom to criticise someone who does appear to have a bit of a dubious past. Hayden seems to know what she is doing, and I don't agree with anyone who is going to try and shut down anyone else who is speaking out against them, especially when it looks like you're intimidating them. Now, Hayden has tried to launch a career as a trans activist, but it doesn't really seem to have got her much traction outside of being a bit of a laughingstock for filing these weird cases. Hayden is simply going to go down as someone who wants to silence in any means necessary. And that is quite a scary thought. So the next person on this list is someone who has actually been a bit of a decorated LGBTQIA++ rights activist. This is a man who has actually helped his own city open their first gay community centre. He also helped arrange pride events and was apparently instrumental in getting an ordinance passed to prohibit discrimination against gay people. So what does one do when they've seemingly accomplished everything they can and their area, including their own church, is seemingly accepting of LGBT people? What do you do when discrimination ends? You apparently make it up. In 2017, Nicky Jolie, a trans man from Michigan, found that his house had been set ablaze. Following the fire, he took to Facebook telling people to use their anger to make change and be a force for good, and his local church actually raised tens of thousands of dollars to support him. But following a police investigation, Jolie was actually charged with setting the fire himself. Church officials who worked alongside Jolie apparently told the police that Jolie was disappointed that the Jackson Pride Parade, something which he was quite instrumental in organising, didn't really attract much controversy or protest, seemingly because he had done his work as an activist and everyone was accepting. Jolie was apparently caught out after his own version of events didn't add up. He was at home at the time of the fire, and he also had gasoline on his jumper. Furthermore, there were emails sent between him and some of his neighbours where he discusses his lawnmower and some gasoline as well. What happened with Jolie set the community quite aback. They'd been very accepting, and a lot of people found him to be a real pillar of the community. Do you see what I did there? I did a plug because I do this series called Pillars of the Community. Now, whilst it should be noted that the trial is still ongoing at this time, what Jolie has been accused of is something we've seen as a bit of a trend over the last couple of years, and especially since Donald Trump won the US elections. We are hearing repeated instances of hate crimes against minority groups. However, some of these are turning out to be quite stretching the truth. A famous example from this year being Jussie Smollett, who said that he was set upon by some Trump supporters shouting, "This is MAGA country," only to turn out that these were Nigerians apparently hired by Smollett himself. It's quite interesting when we're repeatedly being told by the queer lobby that the world is becoming more and more hostile to the very existence of LGBT people, despite the fact that there is more awareness and more acceptance than ever before. We're repeatedly told that there are more and more hate crimes going on, but we never really get much information on what that is. All of this seems to be building up a very alarmist attitude and atmosphere for LGBT people. It enforces the idea that we are all at danger at any given moment, and whilst homophobia, biphobia and transphobia are certainly not things of the past, I don't believe that they are at the escalated levels that we are being told by our community elders, so to speak. People like Jolly, if he did indeed do what he is accused of, and the police seem very certain that he did, is simply another example of people making themselves out to be victims because they simply have nothing else going on in their lives. And if all this wasn't bad enough, in Jolly's house, several pets also perished in the fire, including 2 German Shepherds and 3 cats. So if you're gonna kill innocent dogs and cats because you're not oppressed enough, you're kind of a scumbag, to put it lightly. The argument as to whether trans women should be able to access women's spaces is getting quite heated, and it is something which both sides feel very strongly about, with the trans side being that as long as you identify as a woman in whatever capacity, you can have access to whatever space you like, and the more gender critical side saying that if you have a male body, then you are a danger to anyone who enters that space. This is something which myself as a trans woman have to be very sensitive of. Whilst I certainly do use some women's spaces in public, such as bathrooms and changing rooms, there are points when I might have to question whether it is acceptable for me to use them. This is because I like to think I have a little bit of awareness as to what's going on. The next person I'm going to talk about lacks such awareness. Morgan OShea, who has quite an appropriate name for Halloween.
What are you doing in my swamp?
Thanks to OShea, Vancouver Rape Relief Centre, who specialise in women in some of the most vulnerable positions you can think of, had their public grants removed because they don't accept trans women to use their spaces. And OShea was quite happy to be a part of this defunding, not really showing a lot of emotion about what was going on. And not only this, a couple of months later, when the centre found itself the victim of vandalism, with various nasty phrases painted on the side, and even a dead rat bolted to the door on one occasion, OShea found nothing wrong with this, saying that, well, this is what happens when the community gets angry, as though that somehow makes it acceptable. But OShea is someone who doesn't really seem to think before she says, or at least doesn't really care how other people react. She became known last year as well for defending a particular tampon lover who may or may not be mentioned later in this list. Whilst OShea did eventually turn against Jessica Yaniv, this only seemed to come after being supportive was no longer really morally justifiable. But with the Yaniv situation and the amount of victims that Yaniv has had, OShea still managed to make the situation all about her, as she recently spoke to The Star, a Canadian newspaper, that the Vancouver area trans activists are the most affected by the Yaniv case. Women lose jobs, tranners most affected. So OShea is on this list for being someone that isn't thinking about the repercussions of what they are pushing. They're too focused on the end goal, which is trans rights and acceptance at whatever cost, to not think about the overall optics of what is happening. When you are getting rape relief centres defunded, that is not a look that great many people will be able to support, even if they are advocates for trans rights themselves. You need to be able to look at the situation as a whole before you decide on whether you really want to go down that route, because it is something which is quite extreme. OShea does not seem to care who else is affected in her quest for trans rights. Especially when she's pushing such morally dubious actions, she is not a particularly good look. When it comes to high-profile trans activists that are given the public spotlight, we often see them coming out with more and more bizarre and quite offensive statements. A notable example of this over the last couple of years is, of course, Monroe Bergdorf, who, since 2017, has been getting herself more and more notoriety by, well, coming out with phrases, whether they are racist, sexist, even homophobic at times. However, Bergdorf does not feature on this list because there is someone who I think is maybe a little bit more deranged. Over the last couple of months, I've talked a lot about Rachel McKinnon, the highly controversial transgender athlete who says it is her human right to compete against biological women in cycling. McKinnon has found great success on the track. However, her opponents have not necessarily been so happy about it, and when they make any actions to show their displeasure, McKinnon just brands them transphobes and carries on with her merry day. Now, a lot of that is quite cringy, but that's not why McKinnon is on this list. She is on this list because of her toxic attitude and the lack of people really calling her out, or really any repercussion for doing so. Back in April, McKinnon joked on Twitter about lighting people on fire who disagreed with her. Now, this was quite controversial, and unsurprisingly, she was banned from Twitter. But she came back after an hour or so, after some friends in high places managed to pull Jack's arm and just say, let her on. Now, McKinnon was completely unapologetic, coming back on a bit of a rampage. How dare people speak out and be offended by what she has to say, and actually changed her banner to that of fire, with her standing quite menacingly with a trans-branded brick. Now, that in itself is quite nasty, but, if she wants to joke about that stuff, fine. Free speech, allowed to do that. Can still think you're a bit of an asshole. And then recently she went on another bizarre rampage, this time on the idea that not sleeping with a trans woman is trans-misogynistic and that you are a transphobe for not sucking that lady dick. This is something that I've again talked about at great length, and it seems to spark a conversation with a lot of trans activists siding with her and saying, yeah, this is what we mean. So McKinnon is all about the wild takes. But the real reason why McKinnon is on this list, and it's a shame that I can't put her any higher for obvious reasons, is her comments concerning Magdalene Burns, a gender-critical feminist who died from brain cancer just a few months ago. Before Burns passed, McKinnon said it was actually okay to celebrate her death. And even when challenged on this, refused to back down. This was a view that was shared by some other trans activists as well. So you would think that someone at higher profile would think that they have a little bit of social responsibility there. But when the day came that Burns passed away, McKinnon decided to tweet an animation of a skeleton dancing on a grave. And when called out on it, just said, well, it's Friday the 13th. But the people in the comments seemed to know exactly what she was talking about and were, celebrating. So McKinnon knew exactly what she did. McKinnon has the freedom to be a complete asshole. Of course she does. But that doesn't mean that I have to like her. I think that she is a completely vile person, and when she's given platforms to speak on behalf of the trans community, because that's what all of these activists do, they claim to speak on behalf of us. Look at the representative that you have. Do you really want someone who jokes about grease fires, who laughs at a woman who died of brain cancer, who says that you are a bigot if you have a sexuality preference that isn't pansexual? Is that who you want leading the movement? Do I really need to say who's number one? We all know. We all know who's number one. Like, you're gonna make me say the name? It's kind of like, like the boogeyman of trans rights. Don't know whether I should say Jessica Yaniv. Fine. So where do I start with Yaniv? Is it the recent case where Yaniv took 15 women to court for refusing to wax feminine testicles? Is it the obsession with periods and tampons, going so far as to message women asking about what to do if a young girl wants to be shown how to put in a tampon? Is it the predatory messages that Youre has apparently been sending young women for a number of years? Many victims have been coming forward to talk about exactly what they went through, many of which sounds quite harrowing.
Everyone loves a pussy.
Or is it the random attacks on journalists? Is it the taser? Is it doxing Blair White? Is it getting people banned off social media for criticising them? What hasn't Youre done to earn this top spot? Now, am I going to talk at length about Youre? Well, I already have. I've done plenty of videos on Youre. So I don't know what much else that I can say, really. Youre is incredibly toxic. But thankfully, we're probably going to see less and less of Youre now that the testicle waxing case is drawn to a close, with Youre being massively unsuccessful. Youre has not even touched Twitter, with the only apparent quote being that they now feel very, very depressed and that the tribunal didn't quite understand the nuances of the case. Youre is an idiot. Youre was telling the court that they were having periods when they were 14 years old. That bringing up periods in this bizarre case to begin with. Youre is a joke, but a dangerous joke nonetheless. Whilst I don't think that Youre is going to be relevant for much longer, there are still concerns about predatory actions. And that should not be forgotten, even if the rest of Youre certainly should be.
A real off-the-chain ghoul!
So what do you think of my spooktacular list? Is there anyone that you think earned a spot? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe and share my videos. YouTube seems to have been throttling my views quite recently. You can also support me on Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you all once again, and have a fantastic Halloween.